Hi, I'm John Davis. I want to thank Beth Meyer and the Albemarle Garden Club for inviting me to talk here today. Frederick Law Olmsted was present at and often participated in the key moments of the modernization of the United States. Like a movie character that has an uncanny ability to be caught up in the thick of it, Olmsted brought his keen, if idiosyncratic, insight to bear on the fundamental conflicts and upheavals of the 19th century. Slavery, war, economics, social stratification, labor, urbanization, theories of environment and nature. He was there and he thought about all of it. First in writing and then in design, Olmsted participated in the construction of modern America, the one we currently inhabit. It's a truism that the American Civil War changed everything. Olmsted was swept up in the changes that were in the air, and like many other 19th century Americans, talked in terms of the possibilities afforded by the destruction of slavery and the South's aristocratic plantation economy. They talked about rebirth, about destruction that comes after or before revitalization. They spoke of reconstruction, of building a democracy, an economy, and nation state on the war's tabula rasa. Engineering a new republic, however, was difficult. For all the war's destruction, the long-standing structures of racism and racialized capitalism remained, making the building of a true multiracial democracy an immensely difficult project, one that is still incomplete and requires ongoing effort to this day. Among the Reconstructionists, however, Olmsted differed from his contemporaries. As a true student of people, he knew there were forces at play that would survive the war, no matter how bloody or devastating. His experience of the landscapes of the South before and during the war led him to develop an idea about order, about how people related to one another, how environment shaped social form. The forces in the field, as it were things to contest, to intervene with and in. The design of landscapes became a way to participate in this contest, to fit a vision for environment and society into the changing tides of the United States as it transformed. This afternoon, I want to contextualize Olmsted as an observer and participant in the tumultuous decades around the Civil War. I want to describe him as an essentially well-meaning and energetic person who, like many of his contemporaries, became radicalized by direct experience with horrors of slavery and war, and subsequently became cognizant of the possibilities of reimagining society in a modern way. I'll first talk briefly about his travels through the antebellum South, a subject that my friend Professor Zodi is going to speak about in depth. In the South, Olmsted saw how people's landscapes reflect their social structure and the grim machinery of an oligarchic capitalism based on human enslavement. I then want to spend time talking about his experiences in the war. Olmsted was never a soldier, but served for 2 frantic years in the US Sanitary Commission, a precursor to the Red Cross. His experiences attached to the Army of the Potomac in McClellan's ill-fated Peninsular Campaign in the Virginia Tidewater clarified many things for him. I'll end with a note about how Olmsted's ideas about social organization appear in his landscape design and how we might read them as a way of not just understanding him as a designer, but also understanding Americans of this period. Olmsted is in many ways a cipher for white middle-class Americans of his generation. He was particularly insightful in describing the widely held optimism and naivete, the strange mix of hard rationality and outright delusion that resulted in a society obsessed with organization and whose foundations we still contest with today. I hope today to use Olmsted to understand a bit more about the people who, for better or worse, left us with the political, economic, and physical landscapes we currently occupy. It is my hope to, as with all things having to do with Reconstruction, to elevate some of the project's unfulfilled promises, that we might recognize them and, like Olmsted, be drawn to their possibilities and promise. In order to see Olmsted in this environment, we need to think of the Civil War as a long process, one not bound necessarily by the formal conflict at Bull Run and Appomattox. The changes in the landscape occurred on a long timeline, building over decades and generations, marked out in deeply held landscape practices and worldviews. There were moments of intensity, to be sure, days and weeks and hours when one could feel the world changing. But the majority of the transformation happened at a lower level, subtle, building and ebbing, a tension in the fabric of life, a glacial shift that reveals a different world in the making. Olmsted, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, was able to perceive these long lines of change. His journalistic clarity and unself-conscious earnestness have cemented his legacy as one of the most widely cited sources on the antebellum era and placed him amongst the founders of modern sociology. His feel for underlying social structure and ability to render the invisible visible earned him his reputation. In writing about America, Olmsted again and again seeks to define the contours of a kind of twin modernization occurring. He was a Yankee through and through, very much of a mind that the dynamic capitalism of the North and its ability to organize unseen productive forces through enforceable contracts, division of labor, and hierarchies produce a civic flourishing. In the South, however, he confronted a troubling counterfactual. The South was indeed modernizing, barreling towards a dark alternative that filled Olmsted with fear and loathing. Far from being a pastoral backwater, Olmsted perceived a vibrant commercial culture and sophisticated extractive operation at work in Southern landscapes. This organization relied on brutality to maintain itself, a regime of violence and threat of violence that to Olmsted seemed to completely suffocate any instance of civic life. The brutal machinery of oppression seemed to leave a barren vacancy at the heart of Southern life, a devastation at the center of what the man cared about the most. This realization colored his work for the rest of his life. He worked hard to militate against this vacancy, to fight against the victory of this vision of society, to create space for an American civic life that could meet the promise of the era. I originally began this research several years ago with the goal of understanding antebellum America as a site of conflict, a slow burn that ended up in outright war, and how war was a large concept with a gradient of intensity shaped by landscape, or how it shaped the landscape instead. Olmsted's writing on his travels through the South proved to be an invaluable resource, as they have been to a generation of historians. With a commission from the newly founded New York Times, Olmsted and his brother John departed New York for the South in early December 1852. In the wake of the Compromise of 1850 and the escalating conflict that was resulted in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and bloodshed on the plains, Fred Olmsted was to provide unsensationalized reporting on the state of the American South, particularly on the conditions of the enslaved people held on large plantations. First published serially in the newspaper, Olmsted eventually compiled the reports on a total of 3 trips into the South, into an equal number of published volumes, eventually revising the corpus into a final comprehensive book entitled The Cotton Kingdom, published on the eve of war. A self-professed moderate free soiler, Olmsted was chosen as a temperate counterpoint to the vehement abolitionist reporting in Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. At first, he lived up to the expectations. His reports on places like Virginia and the Carolinas are free of the kinds of sermonizing and maudlin sentimentality that many of his anti-slavery contemporaries resorted to. But the effects of the journey are legible over the course of the 3 books. A sense of adventure present in the first foray into Virginia disappears by the backcountry account, with its more persistent melancholy and brooding on inevitable war. Another aspect of his identity colored, too, the framework through which he critiqued Southern society. At this point in his life, Olmsted primarily thought of himself as a farmer. He owned an experimental farm on Staten Island and had traveled to England to report on the state of, quote, scientific cultivation practices emerging there. So it was agriculture in its varied forms that he focuses on in the South, which also forms the spear point of his argument against slavery. With a farmer's eye for the, quote, systems of culture and irrigation across the South, Olmsted consistently approaches his environs with an attitude that careful description of labor and work life reveal a truer portrait of landscape processes and the social structures they engender. However, Olmsted surveyed this landscape with a solid prejudice in place. He believed that slavery was an enormous, inefficient waste of time, effort, and land. The vignettes he chooses to portray are assembled to advance a thesis about efficiency as a morally superior value. This blinds him often, and combined with the kind of endemic racism typical of his social class, he sees enslaved workers moving slowly in the fields as, quote, plodding laziness, as opposed to desperate resistance under a system of incomprehensible oppression. Regardless of this, he comes to condemn the entire economic base of the slave South as fundamentally flawed, and further, as a breeding ground for infectious agents that corrupt the society it is built upon. Quote, a man forced to labor under their system is morally driven to indolence, carelessness, indifference to the results of skill, heedlessness, inconstancy of purpose, improvidence, and extravagance, end quote. This misalignment of energy was seemingly evident everywhere he turned. Of Louisiana, he wrote his, quote, grave doubt if the capital labor and especially human life could not have been better employed somewhere else. Not only was the bounty of the landscape wasted when spent on extravagant lifestyles of the elites, it too was gravely misdirected downward in the excessive violence it needed to function. In the rice fields of South Carolina, Olmsted came to see the plantation as a landscape of constant vigilance over both material processes and human beings. Terror impelled production, and the common wisdom, as told to Olmsted by a Dr. Cartwright in Louisiana, was that lassitude is removed by, quote, whipping it out of them, end quote. Steady input of violence into the Southern economy was equally a device for time-saving and profit maximization, as well as a powerful self-perpetuating mechanism of dehumanization of the enslaved. Olmsted noticed the social instability such tension produced, as evident by the time he devoted to cataloging the apparatus of enforcement at the level of the field. Quote, under the slave system of labor, Olmsted wrote in Seaboard Slave States, quote, discipline must always be maintained by physical power. The first time he witnesses whipping, Olmsted records that it is indeed the most revolting thing he has ever seen in his life. His original horror is superseded on several occasions. Vignettes of violence pepper the narrative structure of the three books until a noticeable crescendo brings the narrative to a halt, when Olmsted witnesses the brutal beating of an 18-year-old girl on the side of the road in Journey Through the Backcountry. Olmsted recounts the girl's shrieks. She had been hiding behind a bush to get out of an afternoon of work in a paragraph-long recording of pleas and expressions of agony. The South was controlled by threat, coercion, incarceration, and bodily violence. Its geographic pervasiveness horrified Olmsted. And perhaps what he hated most about it was how it was almost entirely performance in the service of covering a basic social instability. The historian Eugene Genovese describes this performance as, quote, an irregular display, alternating between periods of brutal violence and serenity in a dramatic dance meant to retain control and mastery. Genovese asserted that this performance was a symptom of the true fragility of the Old South and made it vulnerable to exposure, as if when made visible, the farce of the structure would immediately begin to falter. The brutal environment, however, appeared particularly robust to Olmsted. Violence was, quote, diffuse, widespread, and banal, mobilized as a kind of everyday social regulation, end quote, as according to the geographers Kirsch and Flint. The asymmetrical conflict that kept Black workers subjugated remained at its heart politically motivated and deep-seated. And above the field overseers was an even more elaborate, almost military structure that flourished in the South cities. In Charleston, Olmsted witnessed a commitment to policing he had never encountered before. The streets of Charleston were patrolled by an armed citizens police, quote, having a military organization. Militarized Charleston was not restricted to singular buildings or military installations, as Olmsted described a city pervaded by the inescapable sound of martial drumming from the arsenal at the Citadel, noted the numerous armed police, and found the town resembled one, quote, in a state of siege or revolution. There was no special occasion. This was simply life under the fear of insurrection and bloodshed. A widespread notion that the, quote, insurrectionary contagion might emerge and become epidemic drove a palpable atmosphere of anxiety amongst Southern whites, to the point where Black sailors were forced to quarantine aboard ships for fear of spreading news of freer lands and more open societies, like the Black Republic of Haiti. Olmsted found the whole system uncanny. Quote, but to go to the bottom of this security and dependence, you come to a police machinery such as you never find in towns under free government. Citadels, sentries, passports, grape-shotted cannon, and daily public whippings of the subjects for accidental infractions of police ceremonies. Olmsted here sketches the apex of the vast array of disciplinary arrangements that constituted what the historian Walter Johnson called the carceral landscape. Noting that slavery was a material and spatial condition as much as an economic and legal one, Johnson's concept describes how a combination of informal, irregular armed militia, regular troops, codes of socially accepted behavior, and even small details like limiting the amount of food slaves might accumulate and preventing them from learning how to swim, created spaces where resistance carried fatal risk and escape seemed impossible. Olmsted marveled at the capacity of the system to create perimeters and police them silently, enforcing the spaces of slavery by a sheer, overarching tension. Of a slave auction in Richmond, Olmsted wrote, I saw no whips, chains, or other engine of force, nor did such appear to be required, end quote. The key to its horror was how presciently modern it all was. Olmsted, in describing the link between militarization and securitization of spaces, particularly in the South's urban centers, feels like he could very well be speaking to us. Indeed, the low-level violence and pervasive conflict of the antebellum era spilled into Reconstruction in the landscapes of Jim Crow, where conflict and brutality simmered for generations. It has been truly revealing to me, when studying this material, to think about how much what Olmsted identified resembles a kind of forever war, where the conditions on the ground doomed people to everlasting and intractable conflict, barring some Herculean effort to enact change. As a result of a near fatal carriage accident outside the Central Park job site, Olmsted was unfit for military duty when hostilities began in 1861. Nonetheless, he threw himself into the war effort, driven by a combination of a sense of duty and an interest in the administration of ever larger organizations. Olmsted joined the U.S. Sanitary Commission, an all-volunteer adjunct group responsible for organizing care for U.S. troops in the field alongside the Army's medical and quartermaster corps. The sanitary commissioners were concerned with all aspects of health, not only mitigating disease, but providing expertise and logistical support for soldiers' diets, their clothing, hygiene, and the basic sanitary engineering of Army encampments. Olmsted approached the problem of creating a health service bureaucracy and logistics network with relish. His experience as the Central Park superintendent aided him greatly. He even recruited some of his staff of architects and engineers he had worked with in Manhattan to populate the commission's ranks. Success in bureaucracy is all about taking pleasure in the form. And Olmsted and creating and proliferating organizational order seemed to fill some deep desire in Olmsted. Quote, I like naturally, or quote, I naturally like, as the Secesh say, exact lines of responsibility, organized official relations, clearly defined, and it is intolerable to me, this chaos, end quote. In a letter to a colleague in the summer of 1861, he outlined his vision for the Aid Bureau, adding that he hoped to inflect the organization with military rigidity and make it, quote, systematic and warlike, end quote. In these moves, Olmsted mimicked railroad corporations who in turn sought inspiration from the military in how to construct organizational machines that function synchronously and across vast spaces. But humans aren't cogs, and Olmsted quickly and often found himself locked in conflict with fellow civilian commissioners and the Army's surgeons in petty turf battles. He was, by many accounts, not a very easy person to work with, and quite inflexible when working himself into a frenzy. His schedule during the war found him working late into most nights, sleeping a few hours on a couch in his office, and rising early to consume a breakfast of black coffee and pickles before returning to his desk. And if that isn't a recipe for burnout, I don't really know what is. His post at the commission gave him access to the bureaucracy of the Yankee Leviathan, and through his new social contacts in the Army and the civil service, glimpses of other roles he might play in the war effort. Early in the war, he asked to be put in charge of the escaped enslaved people who had slipped into the US lines. Deemed contrabands, the Army had struggled to define these people's legal status and role they might play in the war effort. Olmsted was denied the position, but his request betrays a lifelong interest in labor discipline and the creation of new forms of organizing workers into powerful landscape agents. A few years later, he applied to become military governor of the Sea Islands in Georgia and South Carolina. Home of some 12,000 freedmen, women, and children who occupied the abandoned plantations of the Low Country, the Sea Islands were to Olmsted a landscape problem. Having been, quote, wrecked by processes of war, Olmsted saw this administrative project as an opportunity to plan and implement a vision of the post-war landscape. The prospect of organizing a vast swath of the South into scientific, racially egalitarian, agrarian utopia was irresistibly appealing to him. Other duties, however, which dampened his idealistic ambitions, intervened. The Civil War's violence took on unforeseen dimensions in industrialization, mechanization, and destruction. The war far outstripped the expenditures of any comparable conflict and stood as the largest assemblage of destructive capability the world had seen. Olmsted, too, was affected by the unexpected psychic damage brought by a world so rent. After the disastrous retreat from Bull Run, Olmsted was dismayed to find Union officers drinking in Washington's hotel bars, while their men wandered disoriented in the city's public spaces. The mass demoralization of these encounters was almost too much to bear. Here, Olmsted and other Americans felt the hard edge of modernity in the form of the brutal and unromantic machinery of war. Behind the lines in Northern Virginia lay the driving Confederate state, intent on fixing white supremacy, domination of labor, and rapid industrial development from a massive centralized bureaucracy in Richmond, malevolent and threatening to subsume the Republic. In the grim years before the Emancipation Proclamation, the stakes seemed to climb ever higher, while hope became harder and harder to maintain. Olmsted gained firsthand experience with the horrors of war when organizing floating hospitals for McClellan's ill-fated Peninsular Campaign in Virginia. After months of stalling, McClellan transported the enormous Army of the Potomac to land at Hampton on the Virginia Peninsula, preparing for an eventual assault on Richmond. Support for the massive army trailed amphibiously, and it was on the reaches of the James River that summer that Olmsted found the limits of his powers and some of the realities of the larger project of war. On the outskirts of Richmond, at a place called Fair Oaks in Henrico County, Confederate and US forces met in what would become the reality of the war, an inconclusive engagement that produced mass casualties. The thousands of wounded that flooded the riverbanks outside the hospitals after Fair Oaks was so harrowing that Olmsted found it impossible to describe. And of course, it only got worse. Quote, "Then and frequently since," he wrote, "I saw more appalling things than were ever imagined in the wildest mania." End quote. Confined to his hospital ship because of the murderous bushwhackers ashore, the war took its toll on the usually energetic and Olmsted and ultimately exhausted him. He described his home among the, quote, "crowded encampments in hot and malarious climate being aggravated by disappointment, idleness, and homesickness from hope of home hopelessly deferred," end quote. An environment in which grim resolve quickly veered into rage. Quote, "I want to exterminate the slaveholders, or rather slaveholding and the state of society founded on it. To that end, I can work no better here, or I can work here better than anywhere else," end quote. But war was not conducive to his fastidious nature, and overwork and fatigue dimmed his hopes of his project for the war. Before departing for a job with a mining concern in Mariposa, California in 1863, Olmsted leaves one last vision of the war in his archive. It is a grotesquely picturesque description of Grant's waterlogged encampment outside the siege lines at Vicksburg, Mississippi, where, for lack of dry ground, the Union soldiers bury their dead in the grassy slope of the levee, the fresh graves stacking along its face to the high water mark. Reconstruction became, for many Northerners, a design project that worked at the scale of both region and nation. For the more ambitious, it was a chance to remake society and indeed even a chance to excise some of humanity's basic flaws. The war's vast trauma had created this illusion. How could something good not come from the ashes of something so terrible? Olmsted, however, was among the optimistic realists who understood the political complexity that would remain and that the forces that had animated the rebellion would appear as different permutations in different guises. As recent research has shown, the supposed fundamental tensions between the agrarian and industrial schools of thought in the South were largely phantasms, and that changes in the organizational structure of the US South, and indeed even in the larger United States, is best seen as a synthetic cooperation between capital and production. Planters quickly found ways to become industrialists. Oligarchic control of the economic sectors and of the accumulation of massive estates continued at pace. With layers of economic and moral symbolism accruing in the American consciousness, the war and Reconstruction altered Americans' conceptions of public space, land use, state and territory, race, and ecology. In this context, Olmsted pushed for consideration of landscape as a medium for promoting public, civic, and peaceful societal functions. As a designer, Olmsted's lineage lay in the English landscape tradition, which, above all else, prized natural order. Alexander Pope's poetry welded a notion of a beneficent structure in nature to an aesthetic organization of space. This philosophy placed the ordering authority outside of human society and indifferent to humanity's own tendency to construct corrupt social relations. A good order flowed from an authority akin to a large benevolent machine, and that, according to literary historian A.D. Nuttall, the elements of the great chain of being exist for the scheme and not for the benefit of humans. Olmsted's great leap, however, which differentiated him from the garden designers of the English gentry, was that he was a bit of an engineer. Far from being a holy machine, Olmsted thought that nature could and should be tinkered with, enhanced, augmented, amplified. Consequently, he was predisposed to see modernization and the reconstruction of the United States as something that should be aligned with Popian schemes of order, but would take additional organizational work to realize. Olmsted's great aesthetic task can then be seen as a reconciliation of the problems of capitalism and urbanization with Pope's mechanistic and beneficent nature. Olmsted the Yankee shared the belief with others of his social class that dynamic capitalism was naturally emergent, but he had seen firsthand the corruption of the southern branch of that phenomenon. Slavery had created a place where, quote, moral forces in nature, as irresistible as the laws of climate, are blindly disregarded or held in contempt, end quote. The intransigence and resistance to nature seemed a masked illusion with which Southerners concealed from themselves the true dimensions of the cruelty they oversaw. To Olmsted, the designer's job was to allow the machine of nature to produce a durable image of order, in that relationships were apparent, straightforward, and strove to be unpossessed of deception or delusion, of self or otherwise. In the design of Central Park, Olmsted and Vaux balanced public demands with their own aesthetic preoccupations, ultimately producing spaces that served the public as well as satisfied their own notions of how the park could inspire responsible sociability. To accomplish this, they employed spatial devices of different geometric and programmatic organizations, which met in a productive tension. The promenade, considered by Olmsted an essential component of a metropolitan park, was the lone formal element in the otherwise curvilinear and organic park design closely related to the romantic naturalism of the English landscape tradition. A strongly linear arrangement of 300 elms, the promenade deviated from the north-south median line of the park and terminated in the Vaux-designed Bethesda Terrace and Lake, providing a vista to the wooded ramble beyond. Though the promenade strongly implies a travel direction, it resists becoming a continual axial procession. Instead, the visitor finds that it is a zone of overlapping pathways, moved into and out of through eroded corners. The strong geometry of this element was meant to be read in proximity to the dense ramble, whose purpose was to introduce variety, but then also an intensity of foliage and seclusion. The neighboring systems convey their equal importance by evidence of intricacy and displays of energetic and careful design applied equally to both. Together, they are a study in revelation and concealment, a testing of the interplay between two radically different geometric systems, one convoluted, introverted, and resistant to mapping, the other recumbent and at ease in its openness, a natural form of repose. This important moment in the professionalization of landscape architecture shows the discipline as a Victorian project of constructing social relationships in ritualized fashions, with the aim of outlining and containing social actions in attitudes of ease and repose. Olmsted constructed his own post-war notion of social regularity and order against the fragility and weaknesses of the dangerous dance of violence and serenity he saw in Southern society. Olmsted's recognition of this is perhaps his greatest sociological contribution to American culture. The appearance of a formal promenade in Central Park became something of a rare thing for Olmsted. Historians have thought that the terrace at Central Park was his only slip in an otherwise steadfast adherence to the dictum that, quote, formal planting and architectural effect, unless on a very grand scale, must be avoided, end quote. However, several decades later, in the preliminary design for West Roxbury Park, a segment of the famed Emerald Necklace of parks around Boston, the strong formal LA design reappears. Though this element was eliminated in the final construction of Franklin Park, as the West Roxbury Park was eventually renamed, the trace of it indicates the juxtaposition of social possibilities continued to occupy Olmsted's thoughts. Calling the promenade the greeting, Olmsted hoped that it would function as a, quote, place of general congregation, where people may be brought together without clashing, end quote. This public meeting place, expansive and shaded with a view to the rolling meadow beyond, nearly 20 years after the war's end, serves as a reminder of the pain of strife and violence, and the importance in which one man held the mission of creating spaces where hostile intentions would evaporate. These earnest intentions are powerful and therefore easy to romanticize. In thinking about this over the past several years, I've become skeptical of simply claiming that Olmsted created the democratic landscape and leave it at that. It omits too much of the story. Olmsted's landscapes have been absorbed into the core of American iconography, and indeed his legacy can be found lending democratic legitimacy to the globe-spanning project of US empire that took off in the latter half of the 19th century. His hegemony has provided a veil of ignorance over many of the other landscapes of democracy that were produced at the same time. Olmsted's work struck a chord with America, but a white America that was obsessed with organizing its own mythology and legitimacy. The story leaves little room for Black or Indigenous space and spatial practices that proliferated at the same time and offer alternative models of thinking about the geographies of liberation. Note today that Olmsted's story has very little to say about the millions of formerly enslaved people who freed themselves, occupied former work camps, and made spaces of liberation out of far-flung swamps. I don't want to condemn our earnest, pickle-eating friend. Far from it. He was human as the rest of us, which means that we shouldn't mistake his perspective and horizon for the limits of what landscape of democracy was in the 1800s, or even indeed today. Instead, we should look at the tools he left. First, a relentless need to diagnose society by seeing its landscape as an essential part. And second, a faith in design as a service to our social life at its highest levels, even though intentions shift and interpretations change over the intervening years. Olmsted believed in the basic principle that design needs to allow for a true diversity of life in our landscapes. We should too. Thank you.